Thank you very much for having me. A couple of you I saw yesterday, so forgive me if I sound repetitious. But
it'd be useful if everybody introduced themselves.
And I was going to say it'd be great if we could just go around the table and if you could tell me your name, where you come from, and your kind of specific interest in relation to disability rights. So we start with Stephen there, right?
My name is Sandil Nana, and I'm from Zimbabwe. I'm deaf, and my interest is in education.
I'm Nata. I'm from India. My interest in disability has arisen from supervising Mary Keogh, who's doing international development aid and disability after the passing of the convention.
I'm Ignacio, and my interest in this field is more in the children's rights with disability, but more even in the inclusive education now. Is going to be my next research in deep, I hope. So.
My name is Roberto. I'm from Peru. I'm interested in legal capacity, independent living, but in general, the politics involved in disability.
I'm JB. I'm the business manager with the center here.
I'm Alex. I'm from the United States. I go to Northeastern University School of Law, and I'm interested in inclusive education, specifically for people with intellectual disabilities in college and university.
Hi, my name is Aoife Roisin. I'm from Limerick and I'm interning here, and my interest is in children's rights with disabilities.
Hello, I'm Rudranil. I'm from India, and in the center I'm working on legal capacity and mental health in India, and mainly reviewing the different reform laws, that draft bills that have been coming up in the recent scenario that India has ratified the UNCRPD and checking its compliance with tenets of human rights in the UNCRPD.
Oh, me? Okay. I'm Eleanor. I'm from Cork. And I'm a senior researcher here at the centre and work on a number of projects, but I guess my main research interests are in legal capacity, access to justice and disability advocacy.
I'm Kiran. I'm from Nepal. I'm interested in disability and development in general, and I'm doing research for dissertation on community-based rehabilitation and implementation of UNCRPD with the case of Nepal.
Hi, my name's Charlotte. I'm a research assistant here.
Sounds familiar.
It's great to hear another Charlotte. I'm from England, from Reading, which is a town near London. And my research interests are pretty well broadly anything to do with EU and what the EU does in relation to disability. So for the European Yearbook that I help the editors on here at the centre, we also have an intergovernmental section which we report on WHO and the World Bank and their activities. So, and I always find it very hard to make sense of their websites and go through it, so reporting is quite challenging. So if you have any insights there.
Like the website, which website?
The World Bank actually, the Europe section of the World Bank.
Could you tell her a little bit about the advocacy?
Oh yes, we have a project called the National Platform of Self-Advocates for People with Learning Disabilities. We have funding to support a group of 12 people at the moment who are working on creating a vision document to hopefully launch a national, official national platform of people with, of self-advocates, because Ireland currently doesn't have an independent network of self-advocates that independently lobby for their rights on their behalf. That's what I'm
Hi, Charlotte. I'm in the center from Zimbabwe. I'm interested in access to justice for children with disabilities and for women as well, and issues to do with violence, abuse, exploitation, and cultural aspects of it, harmful practices that endanger children and people with disabilities.
My name is Nata Duvvury. I'm based here in this center, and my particular interest is legal capacity and independent living and how they interlink, and also the need for domestic legislation. When talking about personal assistance and the procurement of personal budgets.
Hi, my name is Elaine. I'm a research assistant here at the centre as well, and I work primarily on different research that Jerry's involved with, and also yeah, so I do a lot of the conference that we're organising here as well. And my interest in disability came from when I did my masters, and I did the disability module in public law masters, and kind of went back. So my particular interest would be in the Irish ratification of the CDLP.
Great. Well, it sounds like there's a really interesting crowd of people around here. I feel like I should have two seminars, one on legal capacity and the other one on inclusive education, because it seems like those are the two kind of strong research interests. So what I thought I'd do in the time that I have today is to just briefly speak a bit about the work that USAID does. I'm not going to dwell on that too much because I'd like to speak more broadly about disability and development. And I think, you know, the disability and development issue really emanates from the fact that the convention on the CRPD has a very strong development dimension to it. And I think that that's really important, that it's one of the few human rights, in fact it's the only human rights treaty that has, you know, human rights but a very strong development dimension. And so I think very often when I say we, I think the development workers work in one camp and the human rights workers work in another camp. And I think it's really important for us to start thinking about how we can better integrate rights and development. And so I'll discuss that a bit. But just quickly about USAID. So USAID was the first bilateral donor to develop a disability policy. And the policy was developed back in please tell me if I'm talking too fast. The policy was developed in 1997. And essentially the basis of the policy is a non-discrimination policy. And so it says USAID programming shall not discriminate against all persons with disabilities. And for that time, 1997, that was, you know, it was kind of path-breaking. It was, you know, it was pretty radical. And it was possible because there was a strong U.S. DPO sector in place that really pushed for that. But that then was, in order to bolster that policy, two directives were developed. One directive requires that all contracts and grants, because USAID is essentially a funds development, all contracts and grants should include disability. Now, if you're paying attention, I'm saying shall or should, I'm not saying must. So that was the one directive. The second directive was a must directive. And that was a directive that said no USG funding will be used for the building of any inaccessible buildings. And that was really important. So you had the policy and you had the two directives. And then the Congress put forward what they call earmarks. So it's money that's given to the agency for a specific purpose. And what they did with this earmark was to look at rehabilitation of persons with disabilities. So really focusing on provision of wheelchair, provision of prosthetics and prosthesis. And that program has been going on for the last 20 years and has been fairly successful in, getting wheelchairs out to persons with disabilities. But I think we all know that things have changed dramatically from 1997, and that disability and development is not just about handing out wheelchairs and providing P&O, that it's much more than that. And so most recently, with the current administration, the Obama administration, that has made a very strong commitment to disability, they went ahead and appointed myself as the Senior Coordinator for Disability Inclusive Development in the agency. And I have a counterpart who works at the Department of State. So we work very closely together. Her role is more on the CRPD and kind of human rights piece, and my part is more on the development piece. And I think this is important because, again, USAID is the only agency, bilateral agency, that has a full-time senior person that works on disability. And what does this mean in an agency like USAID? Well, it means that the issue is given visibility, because I work with all the other advisors, the gender advisor, the youth advisor, the water advisor. So the issue is really elevated within the organization. And I think, having somebody present at the table is so important. It really helps push issues forward. So I think the appointment, and whether it's me or not is immaterial, but I think the appointment of a coordinator signaled that the agency was making a strong commitment to the issue of disability inclusive development. So the next question then is, well, what do you do? And what I have strived to do since my appointment was to try from the beginning to institutionalize disability within the agency. And my sense was, how do I do this in a way that's practical? A lot of people were saying, we need to review the policy. The policy is outdated. It hasn't taken into account a lot of changes that have happened in the last 30 years. And it's true, the policy does need to be reviewed. But I felt that there were more strategic areas that I could focus on. And so what I've done in the last 18 months has been to, again, work very closely with the other advisors who have developed policy or are reviewing reviewing policies to include disability into those policies. So there are a whole suite of new policies that have come out of the agency, and these are policies for the agency that provide policy direction on how the agency will work in the countries in which we work. So it's actually really important policy. And so the policies that I have been able to include disability in are the gender policy, the youth policy, the climate change policy, the education policy, the water policy, the urban policy, the democracy, rights and governance policy, the gender-based violence policy. And the idea really is to see this as one aspect of mainstreaming disability throughout the agency. Because my view was, if we just have a new policy, if we just revise the disability policy, we still just have a disability policy. We don't have disability included in all of the policies that apply to all of the programming that the agency is engaged in. And I knew I was forgetting another policy, the global health policy. So I think that that's been a fairly important aspect of integrating disability into the agency's work from a policy perspective. But there's one thing to have policy, and there's another thing to have actual practice. And very often there's this chasm between policy and practice. And to begin to address that, it became very apparent to me that we needed to start looking at having a better understanding amongst staffers, USAID staffers, about what disability inclusive development is, what it means, why it's important for their work, how it fits into their work. And so to that end, we developed an online course that we're hoping will become a mandatory course. And it's basically a very kind of fundamental course on disability inclusive development that takes you through what this means. The idea then is to have a second course that would drill down a bit more and provide more of the kind of complexities around disability inclusive development. To accompany the course, we have a lot of trainings of staffers, and we're constantly working with people who are onboarding to the agency to make sure that they understand that this is an important piece or an integral piece of the development agenda. And it's really interesting to be part of those discussions because very often people understand that disability is important, and then when they understand it's important, they immediately think it's a human rights issue. It's an advocacy issue, it's a human rights issue. They don't see the connection to development. And so there's always this important kind of getting them to see it not just as a human rights issue, of which it is, and it should be, but that it really is part of development. So it's part of our education, should be part of our education programs, should be part of our global health programs, should be part of our Feed the Future programs. And getting people to understand that disability is a cross-cutting issue and that it straddles all of the work that we do is often quite a process. So training remains, I think, a really important part of mainstreaming an issue within an agency. The other thing that we've looked at is the development of tools. Because I think once you get people to understand why it's important to include people with disabilities in their work, in their development work, the next question is, how do we do it? And so the how-to piece becomes really important. So on our education strategy, we've developed technical notes on how would you do this? And it's got a case study of a USAID funded project that looked at inclusive education. And so it's really to show people that it can happen and provide these tools. Another really important part of that has been the agency develops what are called comprehensive development country strategies. And they're basically a blueprint for engagement in country X. So if your issue is not in the CDCS, your issue is not on the table. So I have spent a lot of time working with colleagues to get disability into the CDCS. Whether it's in the area, and of course it depends on the country. So in the case of Rwanda, there was a big project on education. We were able to make the case for inclusion of children with disabilities. In some of the countries where there's conflict, we were able to make the case for gender-based violence, women with disabilities, children with disabilities, the child with disabilities. So it really depends on the particular case that, the particular country that we're looking at. And those CDCSs are important because they provide the framework for how our missions execute their work. And we don't execute from DC. We don't operationalize anything from DC. It's the missions that do. So it's really important to get the missions to understand, and we have missions in over 100 countries. It's important for the missions to understand that disability inclusive development is part of their brief. One of the big shifts I think that we've made in the last couple of years in terms of the thinking within the agency in relation to disability has been the absolute importance of strengthening disabled people's organizations. And really working at ensuring that they understand, they have the capacity to engage, to negotiate at country level. Because for us it really helps if you've got a national development plan that already includes disability. So in the case of Uganda, for instance, their national development plan already included disability. So when we were developing the CDCS, it was really easy for me to say, well, you know, this is already a country priority. I'm not making this up as something I think Uganda should be doing. They've already included it in their national development policy. So that's really important, building capacity of DPOs at country level. I think one of the other important issues has been, again, you know, working with mission staff to get them to understand the importance of disability inclusive development, because they are the people that get the funding for these projects. So that's kind of in a nutshell some of the work that we've been engaged in on disability. I mean, one of the other aspects of of the agency's work is we work through implementing partners. And most of those are US-based NGOs. And so we've been working very closely with those NGOs to get them to understand that disability is an important part of their work. And I think we're beginning to see some successes. And it's interesting because, you know, it's kind of across the board, in terms of issues. So in terms of economic empowerment, we're working with an NGO called Trickle Up, and they have really taken on the issue of disability. Trickle, TRICKLE, and then up, Trickle Up.
I was against trickle down.
Yeah. I hope it trickles down. So anyway, so Trickle Up has worked very much on the economic kind of empowerment side of things. And then we've had, I think, probably the best successes with an organization called IFIS. And IFIS is an organization that typically works on providing democratic spaces and political negotiation skills at country level. And through IFIS, we've really been able to look at supporting elections that are election processes that are accessible to persons with disabilities, and not just accessible in terms of having ramps into the building so people can vote, or ballots that are brailled. I mean, that's really important, but having people with disabilities on the ballot paper itself. And that's been I think an excellent program, because it's my belief, and I was saying this yesterday and I was going to mention it today, that I think that for me one of the most important aspects around disability inclusion is really working towards creating a political base and getting people with disabilities to be seen as a political base in the countries in which they live, because I don't think that has happened now. I mean, we have a number of parliamentarians, disabled parliamentarians in a lot of countries, but we don't really know what impact they have. I think it's once we have a swell, a groundswell, like you have with women. You know, there's no politicians want to make sure that they've got the women's vote. You know, in the US, you wanted to make sure that you had the Latino vote. You know, these are blocks that are very important, I think, for moving this agenda along. So enough said about USAID. Yeah, I'll stop there on USAID. And then just broadly talk more about what I really wanted to talk about. And that's that I think for me there are kind of two messages that I would like to leave you with. The first message is that effective policy making and unwavering focus on progress and persistence in achieving disability development greatly matters, not just for disabled people, but for everybody. And I think that this is something that we may all be aware of in the room, but I think that there are a lot of people that don't understand that, disability policy often supports a much larger set of the population. And so good disability policy, I think, is beneficial for development outcomes and really for society at large. The other issue that I want to leave you with, and I was interested that in Essentia talked about traditions and that, is that social norms play a central role in the relationship between persons with disabilities, agency, and the opportunities available. And I think that it's pretty clear, certainly from the work that I've done, that social norms can either help or hinder that individual's capacity to actually take advantage of those opportunities. And I think that, for instance, an example of that would be that, generally there are ideals and images that reflect what people with disabilities should be doing or can be doing, and what type of behavior is expected of persons with disabilities. And these are pretty universal. I mean, they're beginning to change, but they still are pretty universal. And I think that those need to be challenged in a very kind of persistent way. So again, I was glad to hear that somebody was interested in looking at the inclusion of students with disabilities in higher education, because I think that that's where you start to change that, where you have a feeder of persons with disabilities into the labor force. Otherwise, you're going to continue to have programs where persons with disabilities are expected to do a certain type of work, and that's just unacceptable. I think it's fair to say that in the last quarter century, maybe, we've seen significant gains for persons with disabilities, and that we are seeing more people with disabilities in the labor force. But again, this really depends where you live and what opportunities you have. So it's certainly happening in the U.S. where I work. So when I go to work in the morning, I see, on average, I count, this is like my favorite pastime, I count how many wheelchairs I see on my way to work. And I can see 10, 15. Before I lived in Washington, D.C., I lived in Johannesburg. And I would go from my house to my work, and I wouldn't see one single wheelchair, ever. And if I did, it would be somebody begging on the street in a wheelchair. So that just tells you that, you've got a really different set of situations, and then the ability, maybe not the ability, but the possibility to take advantage of opportunities. And so for me, that's really important. In some countries, we're seeing children with disabilities mainstreamed into regular schools. But in many countries, I was in Uganda not too long ago, the disability organizations were celebrating the fact that the president had announced that he was going to build 4 new special schools just for children with disabilities. And their argument was, well, it's an education. And my argument was, oh no, we don't want that. What you should be looking at is, how do you change the education system so that these kids can go to regular schools and not increase the number of special schools. So again, it really depends on how the issue is being interpreted in the countries in which disabled people live. So I think that the CRPD really, as an international norm, has provided some incredible pathways for inclusion, but it's not enough. It really isn't enough. I mean, I think we have to be particularly deliberate and diligent in developing tools for what this means, for taking cases to the courts, so we get a better understanding of the content of the right that may have been violated. I think that norms do change, which is great, because if they didn't, then we would be in a very bad place. So social norms do change, and I always take heart from the Convention on the Rights of the Child. And I think that there has been, if you think about, certainly in places where I've worked, social norms have changed in terms of how you relate to children. People don't, where I live, and not just the US, as I said, I've lived in South Africa, I've lived in different parts of the world. I think after the introduction of the CRPD and the massive kind of campaigning that UNICEF was engaged in, the end corporal punishment type of campaigns, you don't see people whacking their children in the streets, I mean, there's the odd case, but I mean, I think that I think it's fair to say that there has been a social norm change in relation to how people, relate to children. So that's, for me, is encouraging. I think that it's very important that, again, as we look at ensuring that young people with disabilities access the labor force, that the labor force is welcoming, that it provides reasonable accommodations and provides the necessary support so that they can actually work to the best of their potential. But I do see some kind of critical challenges ahead, and the one challenge I see is that we really lack insufficient data. And there's an article in this CRPD that includes, that addresses the issue around data. I think, it would be really important that we start collecting better disaggregated data on disability, because I think that would really help us better address some of the social norms. I think it would really help us understand how opportunities are accessed by people with disabilities. Is it a particular class of persons with disabilities? Is it people who acquire their disabilities when they're older? Is it a particular type of disability? So really trying to understand, how people access opportunities, how disabled people access opportunities, for me, is an issue of interest. Similarly, I think pathways of empowerment are really important. Where does that pathway start for a person with disability? Does it start from school? Does it start in college? Where does it start from? So those pathways of empowerment, I think, are essential for inclusion. But I think having proper data would help us better understand that. I think that the other challenge is that, it's more than just removing physical barriers. I mean, I think often we think about access as removing physical barriers. Well, yes, absolutely, that's a fundamental part of it. But, I want a better sense of what are the major obstacles to participation of persons with disabilities. Beyond yes, we've got a ramp, yes, we've got accessible bathrooms, what is it that is excluding systematically persons with disabilities from participation? And again, I think this goes back to, is this about being part of or not being part of a power base? And then I think it would be really interesting when we think about removing barriers, to think about what are the other forms of resistance that keep people with disabilities out. I think that, and I keep on harping on this, but I really think that political participation of persons with disabilities in mainstream politics is fundamental for change. Because I think that that provides a space, potentially, to redefine notions of power, and certainly to address issues around inclusion. And I think it helps to shatter that image of persons with disabilities just as charitable beneficiaries. And it helps to, for me, I think it helps to see people with disabilities as contributors to society, and in this case, in a political way. And that in that way, you're providing, hopefully, voice to a very big base of millions of persons with disabilities. I think the other area that I see as a challenge is the issue around empowerment. You know, empowerment is a word that we use really loosely, and I think we need to think about empowerment as being the expansion of people's ability to make strategic life choices in the context of the ability where it was previously denied to them. So I think for me it means, what does this mean for people with disabilities when opportunities are so limited? You know, how do you access, what does empowerment mean if you live in Burkina Faso, for instance? So for me, those are questions that I continue to think about. I also think it's important for us to get a better grip on understanding what empowerment means for disabled people and what empowerment means for non-disabled people. And having that understanding, I think, is very useful. Because I think that because of a previous disadvantage, empowerment is going to be very different for persons with disabilities across the board. I think that what we need to be thinking about is, how do we ensure that empowerment, inclusion, participation are sincerely taking persons with disabilities along with them. And I'm not talking about, you know, let's bring in the disabled people for the consultation. It's about how do we ensure that there is a political stake for persons with disabilities in participation. How do we ensure that inclusion is really about inclusion, and that empowerment is about helping people or working with people to make strategic choices about what they can or cannot do. So in conclusion, I just think that inequality and exclusion are unfortunately part of all societies. And whether it's unequal power or opportunities, outcomes, or access to justice, I think in most societies you have structures and institutions to address some of those inequalities, that exclusion. But clearly it's not in all societies. And so again, it's about, you know, where you are and what you have access to. If you have been excluded and you have, for instance, from the education system, and you're disabled and you're able to go through the court system, that's excellent. In some countries, that's just not an option. So I think having institutions, whether it's national human rights institutions, where grievances or violations can be reported, alternative forms of the formal justice system may be necessary. So I think that, you know, even in some countries where you have excellent access to justice, the exclusion of persons with disabilities is still rife. And it takes me back to the original question, which is, why do we continue to see the systematic exclusion of persons with disabilities, even where we have good legislation, strong institutions, some participation, and strong civil society? And I think for me, those are some of the hard questions that we need to think about. And I don't have the answers, but I'm hoping that, you know, young researchers like yourselves will start thinking about how do we break that nut? Because even in well-resourced countries, people with disabilities are still being excluded in many instances. So I think we need to think about how do we understand more fundamentally what drives that sense of them and us. And I'll end there.
Thank you so much. That was really, really excellent. And I think I'll just say a few remarks and then open it up for discussion. Obviously, I'm coming from a gender perspective, and many of the challenges and much of your talk is still very, very relevant to the field of gender analysis. One of the important things I think is to meet some of the challenges that you've outlined. It is important to go back and look at the integration of gender into development, because many of the aspects that you have talked about are already have been the challenges that gender mainstreaming face. And it is really important that mainstreaming of people with disabilities in development should draw on the lessons from gender mainstreaming or mainstreaming of HIV. Because one of the important things is, you know, the appointment of you as a senior coordinator is very, very big, momentous step forward. But we find in gender mainstreaming, it's about, is there a focal point, but it's about the location of that focal point. Where in the institution is the focal point placed? Is it out separately in one little institution, little unit? Or is it in the policy unit? Or is it in the director's office? And what we have seen in developing countries, the most effective location is when you're in actually the Prime Minister's office, or you're in an independent ministry, but that has strong links to the PMO's, Prime Minister's office. So location is extremely important. The second element that I think is really important when we're thinking about mainstreaming disability into international development institutions is, I think the strategy that you used of integrating disability into the different policies, so kind of sector-wide policies, is an excellent and effective strategy. But at the same time, the real crunch comes at resource allocation. The actual resources that are available for implementation of the specific programs and that are required to ensure these policies actually, you know, translate into disability, creating the opportunities that you're talking about for people with disabilities. And in gender, that's a big issue. We have gender analysis, we have gender focal points, but there are no budgets, no resource allocation. So that's another big issue. The third is this is stigma. And stigma is a major block. In gender also, there is stigma. and it is about when we're trying to develop the capacity of people to understand disability or understand gender, has to be rooted in that the personal is political. It's stepping those boundaries and making sure that we're addressing the personal and the political and the interweaving of the personal and the political. That's I think, something in training courses. It's very, very important. And then finally, it's about, when you were talking, I was struck by the fact that in the field of gender, one of the issues that we have faced is that it's Western imposed. It's not part of our culture. And I don't know whether in the field of disability that is less so, that it's not Western, because in all societies there is a sense of that we have to care for those who are vulnerable. But women are not necessarily seen as vulnerable in a lot of societies. So those are just sort of some broad points I wanted to raise just for the discussion.
Great.
Okay, so should we open it out? Or do you want